Welcome to this lecture series on strengthening EU environment law that we offer to the Maastricht University students who are here on site. But we also offer this to the public at large, so therefore also online participation is possible. And moreover, the lecture is recorded and we will put the recording on YouTube and at our website so that it is largely available. Also, today our lecturer is online and I'm very pleased to welcome my colleague, Dr. Melita Carević from Zagreb University in Croatia. I'm very pleased that you participate to our lecture series, Melita. I met Melita last year during a summer course that she organized in Zagreb on EU climate law. And in return, I'm truly happy that she participates now to our lecture series. I'm also very happy to see that one of the participants to the summer course last year in Zagreb participates here today in Maastricht, now being a student of Maastricht University. Dr. Carević will focus on EU climate law, and EU climate law is a huge body of law. And she will particularly focus on the carbon removals, the specific legal aspects of carbon removals. A very important, but yet not sufficiently debated topic. The lecture will take about 45 minutes, after which discussion will follow, which we will not record. Well, having said this, Melita, you can take the floor and I look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Peters. I'm really happy to be a part of this lecture series. I was always very interested to follow it online and found it very interesting and very useful. And I appreciate the project you are currently heading. So thank you for the invitation and thank you to all the students who are interested in this topic. My goal today is to talk about the EU's path to climate neutrality and how it's supposed to get there. I will briefly at the outset mention what the concept of climate neutrality actually entails, and I will then speak how the EU is trying to lower its emissions, but also remove those emissions who are already in the atmosphere in order to reach climate neutrality. So I'll focus on these three main points in my lecture. I'll be happy to answer questions at any point if you'd like, or of course, at the end as well. So, to get things started, just to give you a brief overview of the concept, what does climate neutrality actually mean? To keep it simple, it means a balance of greenhouse gas emissions that have been released into the atmosphere and those greenhouse gas emissions which are removed from the atmosphere. The IPCC has a more formal definition, so the Intergovernmental Body Panel on Climate Change, which represents the unified scientific approach to what is currently happening in the climate. It defines the climate neutrality as a concept of a state in which human activities result in no net effect on the climate system. Achieving such a state requires balancing of residual emissions, so those emissions which are still present, with emission removals, as well as accounting for regional or local biogeophysical effects of human activities that, for example, affect surface albedo, that's the capacity of the surface to reflect sunlight, or local climate. So, in other words, reaching climate neutrality doesn't mean that we'll completely stop emitting greenhouse gases. It only means that we will neutralize those greenhouse gas emissions which come into the atmosphere with carbon removals. In order to reach that, we have to take account of something called, which is the climate budget. So the climate budget, or the carbon budget, is an estimate of how much more greenhouse gas we can put into the atmosphere in order to surpass the most dangerous consequences of climate change. And the Paris Agreement says that we should keep the global increase of temperatures to 2 degrees, and even to take the best effort to keep it even under 1.5 degrees. The IPCC, the current science, tells us that if we want to keep the 1.5 target achievable, we should reach as a continent climate neutrality by mid-century. So the Paris Agreement also says that we should achieve this balance by mid-century or in the second half of the century. But with the latest IPCC reports, we've realized the sooner the better. And the mid-century is actually the best chance we have at keeping the increase of global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So climate neutrality means that we balance emission reductions and emission removals. I will firstly mention emission reductions and what the EU is doing to reduce its emissions, and then its efforts to actually achieve emission removals or carbon removals. So with the Green Deal, the idea has been presented in 2019 that Europe should be a climate neutral continent. And the European climate law, which is actually a short name for a complicated regulation, which was adopted in 2021, sets a binding target for the European Union to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. So it's now a legally binding target. It's set in Article 2 of the European Climate Law, which says that union-wide greenhouse gas emissions and removals shall be balanced within the Union at the latest by 2050, thus reducing emissions to net zero by that date, and that the Union shall aim to achieve negative emissions thereafter. So this means that actually the EU has quite an ambitious legally binding target. And it's even more ambitious after 2050. So climate neutrality, the balance of those emissions which are released into the atmosphere and which are removed from the atmosphere should be in balance by 2050. But after that year, we should actually go towards net negative emissions, meaning we should be deducting more emissions from the atmosphere that we're actually putting into the atmosphere. If you pay close attention to the wording of Article 2.1, you will actually be able to conclude that this only means that Europe should be climate neutral on the basis of production-based accounting, not consumption-based accounting. So the Paris Agreement and international law sets obligations for emission reductions for member states for those emissions which take place on that territory. And in the European climate law, Europe is only actually making an obligation to have net zero balance of those emissions it emits from its territory, or if they actually are being deducted at its territory. So that doesn't mean that we as European citizens are going to have a completely guilty-free conscience when it comes to climate. We will still most likely be liable for more consumption of greenhouse gas emissions, because a lot of greenhouse gas emissions we consume, and we are the practically most intensive carbon consumers in the world, they're coming from third countries, and they do not count into our quotas. So even though European targets might seem pretty ambitious, and in all matters they are still not making Europe completely of a completely guilty-free conscience in the eyes of climate neutrality globally. So we need to achieve climate neutrality globally if we are to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement, and that is keep the global increase of temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what the EU is doing is ambitious, but it is not sufficient to keep the whole world on track. In order to reach this climate neutrality objective, EU, of course, has to have some sort of mid-targets. And it has set a binding target to reduce its emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. The Commission is currently proposing a target for 2040, and it is quite in line with the scientific recommendations. It's a 90% reduction target by 2040. Scientists or NGOs and environmental activists would be much happier with a 95% target, but this is still close enough to get us on track to climate neutrality in 2050. So in order to reduce its emissions, the EU has several targets to help it achieve those goals. And it's actually putting those targets in place in order to implement its obligations under the Paris Agreement. So currently, the targets I've been mentioning so far are greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, but also to keep developments going in other areas, EU has a special energy efficiency target for 2030. It's 11.7% reduction in energy consumption, and it has a special renewable energy target, and that's also now set for 2030. It's at least 42.5 degrees energy coming from renewable sources aiming for 45 degrees from renewable energy sources. So if we have a look into the future, this is what the European Commission projects that emissions in the European Union could look like. So the dotted black line represents the pathway we need if we want to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Under this horizontal line, which says zero emissions, you have a green area, which actually indicates that some of the emissions will be deducted mainly through the sector of land use change, and forestry. Those are carbon sinks, mostly natural carbon sinks, which I'll be mentioning in the second part of the lecture. And we also see a bit of a red line at the bottom, which means that some of the removals are expected to come from industrial removals, from special techniques for removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. All other emissions are actually expected to drop significantly. Energy production should practically cause no emissions. Industry is expected to cause some greenhouse gas emissions. The heating of buildings and transport are still going to cause some emissions, as well as agriculture. And waste is also inevitably going to cause some emissions. So when we are going to talk about carbon removals, we'll mostly talk about the land sector and agriculture. That sector is currently responsible for around 10% of greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union. And just to give you the broader picture, the European Union is currently responsible for around 6% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So in order to lower its greenhouse gas emissions, I'm sure you talked about this at some point, we have in the European Union regulation dividing the entire effort into the emissions trading scheme and non-ETS sectors. The non-ETS sectors, here we have agriculture, buildings, transport, small industry, waste. Some of these sectors are going to be transferred into the ETS, such as road transport and buildings. It currently covers around 60% of greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union. It has binding targets for member states, and it usually works through standard setting and some also market instruments. For instance, a standard which has attracted a lot of attention is how much CO2 emissions are cars allowed to actually have in the future. If we have a look at how the European Union is actually on track to fulfill those targets, we see that the picture is not so perfect. A lot of countries are lagging behind regarding reductions in the non-ETS sectors. And we have some really practically big countries here having troubles in these sectors. For instance, Croatia is also not doing great, but also, well, we could do better. Let's just call it like that, given the size of our economy. The ETS sectors, I suppose you have heard about the Union Emissions Trading Scheme, which is a cap and trade system established by a directive from 2003, covers mostly power generation, industry, domestic aviation, and so on. And actually, it's the best known global example of a cap and trade system for greenhouse gas emissions. I'll just say that the ETS has done a relatively good job And since its introduction, it has managed to keep the emissions down in those sectors for around 41%. The data is maybe 2 years old, so it might be even more now. So this is what the European Union is doing to reduce its emissions. And as we said, the other part of the equation is the emission removals or the carbon removals. This is where the story gets slightly less clear and a bit more, let's say, uncertain what is going to happen in the future. So carbon removals, we can distinguish natural and technological artificial processes. It mostly works in a way that the carbon which has been emitted into the atmosphere gets removed and somehow stored. The longer it is stored, the better it is, because once greenhouse gases are emitted into the atmosphere, they have a tendency to stay there quite long and cause trouble or global warming. So at least 3 to 10 centuries, those greenhouse gases which are emitted into the atmosphere are going to be causing global increase of temperatures. So what has been done in the past and what is being done now is going to reflect long-term in the future. And this is why it's important that we conduct carbon removals, because as we saw, even Europe is not fully on track to actually achieve its greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, and the rest of the world is also lagging behind quite substantively. If all the pledges of all the parties of the Paris Agreement are to be combined and realized actually in the future, we would still be facing temperature increases around 2.5 degrees Celsius towards the end of the century, if not sooner. So that means that given our best efforts and the stance of the legislative binding targets and policy making, we are simply not going to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement. That means that carbon removals are a necessary part of the equation of getting to carbon neutrality and to getting to practically this safe bubble of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase of temperatures. So we simply will have to deal with some sort of carbon removals. Those carbon removals, which have been happening in the nature without human intervention, are called natural sinks, carbon sinks. Those are natural processes which happen in the environment, such as the ocean, the soil, the forests, wetlands, and so on, where they actually bind carbon from the air in the photosynthesis process and store it in the soil, in the trunks of the trees, in the roots, in the ocean. So they practically, it's part of their life circle to store carbon more or less permanently into the parts of the plants or into the soil. Technical solutions which have been developed in the past, let's say 20, 30 years, try to replicate this process. By using technologies, they try to capture carbon which has been emitted and store it. There have been a lot of discussions and there's been a lot of research what actually constitutes long-term storage and safe storage. Some geological formations are more apt, actually capable of storing carbon securely for a longer period of time. Others are less. In the European Union, there is a limited availability of areas which can hold geological storage of carbon securely and long-term. So all these solutions, all these carbon removals we're taking into account and mentioning, you should be aware that we simply are bound by some natural constraints of how much we can count on them to reach the net zero target. They can, by their very nature, only be a supportive solution. The main, actually, type of action which is going to take us to carbon neutrality is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon removals can act as a solution for those emissions which will still persist despite our best efforts to reduce them in our economies. Because, for instance, waste, when it decays, when it decomposes, it naturally causes some greenhouse gas emissions, methane, nitrous oxide, and so on. When we produce certain products, such as cement, in that industrial process, some greenhouse gas emissions necessarily take place. So it's not because we're spending fossil fuels, wasting, producing CO2 through burning fossil fuels and producing energy. It's just because these processes, in their very nature, produce greenhouse gases. So despite best human efforts, it is still quite inevitable that some greenhouse gas emissions are going to take place in the future. And carbon removals have been at first intended to deal with those emissions. And the European climate law, being aware of this, limits carbon removals to 225 million tons of CO2 equivalent for the 2030 emission reduction target. But so far, we do not have any strict limits for the 2050 target. That means climate neutrality. So practically, after 2030, the door is open for all possible solutions to help us get to climate neutrality. All the technical solutions, such as the carbon capture and storage, have so far not been deployed on a large scale. They are quite costly and they take time to implement. This is why the EU has been emphasizing the need to turn to natural processes a lot. So even in the Green Deal, there have been a lot of strategies talking about biodiversity, the farm-to-fork strategy, for instance, making our food production more sustainable. The entire, agriculture policy of the EU is switching towards more sustainable production. And there has recently been a regulation adopted, which is aimed at complementing those other policy areas and efforts. This is a regulation on certification of carbon removals into the European Union. It has just been adopted at the end of last year. Negotiations and the drafts of this regulation have been circulating and have been first proposed in 2021. So it's a relatively short time span, around 3 years, in which the EU legislator has strived to produce this quite innovative concept of carbon removal certifications. And this is, I would say, for instance, this regulation is a first step to help us be more aware of certain ways to remove carbon, but it has left us slightly in the dark because it doesn't actually tell us what are we supposed to do with these carbon removals once they are certified. It leaves the door here quite open. So this regulation establishes a first EU-wide voluntary framework for certifying carbon removals, carbon farming, and carbon stored in products. It's voluntary, so the farmers don't have to comply with it. Nobody forces them, for instance, to certify their carbon removals, but it's just an option, something they can do. And there is an underlining note in the regulation that the reason why you would do this is for financial gain. And if you are expecting financial gain from your carbon removals, well, the most logical thing you might want to do is to sell it to someone who wants to offset their emissions with those removals. And this leaves a lot of space for greenwashing. So just to paint you the picture, what the problem is, one of the biggest oil companies, Shell, has recently been found for falsely portraying its LNG production, liquefied natural gas production, as climate neutral. You might think, okay, how can a fossil fuel, a gas, be climate neutral? Well, Shell actually purchased some carbon offsets from certain clean projects, certain projects to improve farming in rice fields in China, where those rice fields would implement different irrigation practices and different farming practices, which would make rice fields emit less greenhouse gases, less methane, and so on. And since they were practically also storing carbon, Shell purchased those offsets for justifying its, let's say, liquefied natural gas production and calling it green. So in the end, it proved that those carbon removals and carbon reductions in China didn't actually bring any new additional benefits for the climate, that there were no new actual removals taking place, and that Shell had falsely portrayed its LNG business as carbon neutral. So this is where the problem actually lies. If those carbon removals prove to be not additional removals, if they are counted twice as offsets, we can actually have a false picture that we are removing carbon from the atmosphere. In the end, we're actually not doing that. So fears of greenwashing have been literally expressed throughout the entire legislative process of this regulation, and it has been criticized for leaving the door open and for not actually saying what we're supposed to do with carbon certification of removals once they are verified. So I'll talk briefly about this regulation, and then we'll spot some of these troublesome points. The regulation itself lays down procedures for monitoring, reporting, and establishing verification of carbon removals. And it aims to do so it can actually help you designate those green technologies if you want to finance them, and to have clear procedures in place exactly to fight actually greenwashing. So it doesn't tell us how you can use the certificates, but it says that the certificates for these removals can only be used to fulfill the EU's nationally determined contribution for the Paris Agreement. So we only know for sure that this carbon removals in the European Union cannot be sold to some third party outside of the EU, which would then comply with its Paris Agreement obligations, thanks to those carbon removals. So this is the only limitation. Carbon removal is defined in this regulation as anthropogenic removal of carbon from the atmosphere and its durable storage in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lasting products. So it actually envisages quite a lot of different solutions. That removal of carbon is mostly taking place through biogenic carbon, which is circling in our ecosystem from biomass, from, for instance, decaying or organic matter from trees, from plants, then goes into the atmosphere at CO2 when they decompose or burn, and gets back into biomass through photosynthesis. Technical solutions are also actually capable of capturing fossil fuel carbon, and this is the carbon which gets released into the atmosphere and then by technical solutions is being caught and stored again in geological formations. So this regulation covers soil emission reductions, and also it refers to a couple of practices which are capable of removing carbon from the atmosphere. It talks about permanent carbon removals, which are supposed to last for centuries, about carbon farming, which means a change in practices, how we farm our land or how we manage our lands in order to keep more carbon actually stored in the ground. And it also talks about carbon storage in products. Those are all the practices, for instance, which are capable of preserving carbon in a product for at least 35 years. An example is, for instance, when you produce timber, and with that timber, you build the house. For carbon farming, it's considered to conduct carbon removal if you can guarantee that the carbon is going to be stored for at least 5 years. So some of these definitions here are slightly complicated. This is why I've put also a different type of categorization of different types of storage distinguished by the regulation. So with permanent carbon removals, those which are capable of keeping carbon safely stored for centuries, we can actually differentiate some technical solutions, so not natural processes, but technical solutions. For instance, one of them is direct air carbon capture and storage. This is a technology which extracts CO2 from the atmosphere and which then stores it in geological formations. The information I got from the International Energy Agency is that so far there are 27 direct air carbon capture and storage plants which have been commissioned today worldwide, which only capture 0.01 megatons of CO2 per year. In comparison, every year we emit, or last year we emitted 37 billion megatons of CO2. It takes 2 to 6 years for these plants to become operational, to become functional, from construction, research, and so on. So, in short, this is not a large-scale solution which is now readily available. The EU is investing a lot of money and facilitating investment in green technologies, in carbon capture and storage technologies. It's providing, facilitating state aid for these technologies. So it's putting a lot of hope that in the future, we are going to be able to rely on them, but yet we are not. Another solution, which is considered to permanently store CO2, is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and other similar methods which use biomass. So it actually captures CO2 when we burn biomass, and in that process we can also generate energy. As well as direct air carbon capture and storage, the deployment of these technologies is quite low, and only around 2 megatons of biogenic CO2 is currently captured per year. There's also another option called carbonation. It's chemically binding CO2 permanently into a product. For instance, when you produce chemical reactions of CO2 with calcium, magnesium, or iron, you can actually store it permanently in that product, and this is a technique which has been explored by the cement industry. So there are options how we can use these technologies to long-term store safely carbon. Carbon farming, we said, are all those practices which enhance carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks, and storage in forests, soils, and which last for at least 5 years. And here we have something really actually unexpected in the regulation. It says that it actually links reduction of greenhouse gases in the farming sector with removals of greenhouse gases, which we said doesn't make a lot of sense to mix the two. Reduction of greenhouse gases is the method we should primarily be striving towards to reach our net zero goals. If we're not able to do that, we can actually count on carbon removals, but treating them the same way doesn't make a lot of sense. Carbon farming actually refers to a wide variety of practices in the agricultural sector. One of very important ones is wetland and peatland rewetting and restoration. So wetlands and peatlands are actually ecosystems which cover around 3% of Earth's surface, but can be responsible due to bad management and due to their turning into farmland for around 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's approximately even more than the entire airline industry is responsible for. The way this ecosystem work is that they actually have plants or special types of mosses which are able to hold a lot of CO2 in their roots and store them in soil. When the matter starts decomposing and if there's not enough water in the ecosystem, there's a lot of decomposing taking part, and methane, a really powerful greenhouse gas, gets released. So improper management of these ecosystems can be really harmful for the climate. And now in countries such as Ireland, which have a lot of these ecosystems, there's a lot of attention being paid to their restoration, re-wetting, and also using for farming when possible. Another practice is agroforestry. It means actually planting trees in places where you wouldn't usually find them on farms. It means planting trees in the fields, in the places where cattle is being kept and so on, in order to increase the capacity of that ecosystem to store carbon. It also takes a lot of land, so be aware that this is something which takes a limited amount of land which we have dedicated to farming and to agriculture. There are also a lot of soil protection measures which are being explored, like seeding cover crops. So mainly in intensive agriculture, you usually have one type of crop being planted, and that is the so-called cash crop, the crop which is supposed to bring income to the farmer. And it's intensively being exploited just to grow that crop, and that means you have to use a lot of artificial fertilizers, which actually emit a lot of nitrous oxides and that are damaging for the capacity of the soil to store carbon and for the climate as well. So by introducing these cover crops, you're actually using the period where the main crop is not being harvested, and you plant some other crops, such as, you can even plant grass, but just to give the opportunity to the land to have some other organic matter, which is going to serve as compost later on, and for the land to recover a bit. So this is similar as crop rotation. You change different compatible crops on the same piece of land and not just exploit the land with one crop. There are also practices advocating no tillage. So if you have a farm somewhere, a photo of a farm in your head, you mostly have a big machine plowing big pieces of land. So modern farming is supposed to restrain from tillage, because tillage breaks the connections in the soil, and it actually reduces the health of that soil and the capacity of that soil to store carbon. So now different types of practices are being advocated, also planting more trees and so on. So the last type of, let's say, method which the directive envisages for carbon storing is this carbon storage in long-lasting products, such as use of timber for construction purposes. In order to ensure that the quality criteria are in place, the regulation itself sets certain methods how to ensure that there is no greenwashing. It says that we are going to determine the quantity of these removals according to a certain formula, which takes into account this activity of removing carbon as well. So how much the activity itself is causing greenhouse gas emissions, it's also been taken into account. Then each carbon removal should be additional, meaning without this incentive to remove the carbon with these new projects, it wouldn't take place. and meaning that this removal should go beyond the union and national statutory requirements. So it should go beyond the legal obligations to reduce carbon. It should be additional. It should also be long-term. Long-term means that the operators of the farm, but it's not precisely defined, they need to show that they aim to ensure long-term storage, that they are going to monitor and mitigate the risk of this carbon leaking, and that they should be subject to liability measure. Long-term storage is somewhat, this principle is being departed from for carbon farming practices, which I said only last for 5 years, or this long storage in carbon products, which only lasts for 35 years. Meaning that after 5 years, this certificate is going to be expired. And after 35 years, also the certificate for long-term storage in products is going to be actually expired. So this is practically one of the biggest downfalls of this regulation. If we are counting on removals as something permanent, if we are counting that greenhouse gases which have been emitted into the atmosphere have been permanently removed and stored, then how can this change after 5 or 35 years? Are we going to keep track so precisely every 5 years how much carbon is being emitted from which farm? Can this get us into accounting problems and actually put the entire effort of reducing greenhouse gases and reaching net neutrality target into a mathematics exercise, which is really, really complex and hard to monitor? So this is definitely one of the, let's say, weaker sides of this regulation. The regulation has also been criticized for its stance towards sustainability. It does say that activities should do no significant harm, and that they should generate some other co-benefits, such as climate change mitigation, sustainable protection of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, and so on. Just one of them is sufficient. So it doesn't actually mean that all these activities should genuinely contribute to biodiversity and to other values which EU is supposed to be preserving in the environment. All these reasons have led to a lot of NGOs and a lot of actually institutes to react quite aggressively towards the proposal and the final text. Here you have a list of 12 problems with this proposal. I've mentioned some of them. Others which are mentioned here is that this solution might lead to land grabs. So land is getting increased value, and it's going to be maybe targeted by big farming firms, and less available to small farmers who might be genuinely interested in these ecological practices. So it's also been criticized because the EU has been looked upon practically by the entire international community as a role model for climate change regulation and legislation. If something like this becomes a role model globally, there is a big risk of greenwashing, because the regulation itself is not precise. What are the next steps? How we should actually be using these certificates? So the European Scientific Advisory Committee on Climate Change, a newly established body of experts which should help European legislator and policy makers to reach decisions about climate change, has warned in a recent report that adherence to carbon removals should only be additional to strong effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The EU is currently struggling to reach its reduction targets, especially, as we said, in the effort sharing decision, meaning in the agriculture sector as well. This problem is not just characteristic for Europe, it's characteristic for the global community as well. Of all the around 100 countries which have made net zero pledges, none of the G20 countries are on track to reduce their emissions. So the use of carbon removals is definitely inevitable to help us get to net zero, but their contribution to carbon neutrality can be genuine only if we ensure that their environmental integrity is strengthened. Meaning, we should not allow for double counting of offsets. Those offsets or carbon removals should definitely be genuine and not be practically artificial or not additional to the baseline, which is going to happen normally on the market or in the ecosystem. The final spot of hope is now directed towards the European Commission, which should develop technical rules and methodologies for implementing this regulation. And a lot depends how these baselines are going to be developed and assessed. So still there's a lot of, let's say, chance for improvement, but also a lot of risk of greenwashing. I think I've used my time and I'd like to stop here for the time being, but I'll be happy to answer any additional points in your question section. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I am not sure whether you could hear the applause from the hall. That's very nice. Thank you, Melita, for this very clear lecture. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.